Hi, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
All right, I have finished something that I started when I was a very small child. I have finally finished watching the entire Star Wars saga. Now, not all the side movies and all that stuff, but the core 9 movies. Just finished watching The Rise of Skywalker this past week when it came out. My nephew, Dimitri, my son Gunnar, and I went to see it. I have to say that I'm pretty disappointed in how Star Wars ended. I don't think I am alone in this, and I have a lot of critical things to say about the last movie, The Last Jedi, and this movie, The Rise of Skywalker, and I feel like it was kind of a mess of a movie. And I realize that I'm not alone. There's a lot of people that have criticism about these movies that have come out and other things that have come out popular culture-wise, like Game of Thrones, or maybe things even in the past like Dexter, or how shows have ended, how filmmakers in Hollywood have treated storylines and how they're changing things and not really honoring stories and storytelling. And so you and I, Antonia, have been online the last couple of days watching some really funny critics on YouTube, and there's really some interesting criticisms coming from YouTube, which are breaking down popular movies and television. And I'm learning a lot about filmmaking, around storytelling, around character development, just by watching people who have made a study of film and television making and storytelling, and then breaking it apart and breaking down why certain movies and certain TV shows didn't work. I've been learning a ton. And I've also been learning a ton about being critical in general. Because I think right now, at the time of this recording in our world, criticism is on the rise. There are so many critics. And look, I just did it too. I started off this podcast being critical of something. I didn't get specific about why I didn't like the movie or thought it wasn't very good. But I started off this podcast also being critical. And I think it's so easy for us in our modern world to find what's wrong with things, pick them apart, and generally send out a message of negativity, criticism, undermining, and disenchantment into the world. And everywhere I turn now, I seem to be finding this. Everything is rated, stars and thumbs up or down. It's just like, it's starting to get overwhelming to me. Every time I want to go to a restaurant now, I check the Yelp reviews or the Google reviews. And I'm like, why am I doing this? I don't take risks anymore. I check in with the criticism first. I buy a book on Amazon. I check in with the critical reviews. I buy a product. I check in with the critical reviews. I get an Uber ride. I check in with the critical reviews of the Uber driver that's going to pick me up. Everywhere we turn, we're using criticism to help us make better choices. But I think it's also creating a culture and a society. I don't know, man. It just feels like it's not the right way to be going about stuff. So today what we want to talk about on the podcast is how can we think about criticism? How can we think about being critics ourselves and the critics around us in the world? What kind of thinking can we bring to this in our world that will help us with our personal growth, help us make better decisions, help us navigate through our lives in a more effectual way, and not have all this weight of negativity and criticism that hangs on us at every step we take?
You just mentioned something really I thought was interesting, which is that as we're listening to some of these critics on YouTube, we're getting an education.
Yes.
And the reason why we're getting an education is because, well, first of all, I like to think we're choosing the right critics. Like they're entertaining, and they're oftentimes actually funny, charming, and they have an understanding of core fundamental storytelling. The one that I love the most, his name is the Critical Drinker, I believe. He's got this really strong Scottish brogue, and he's hilarious. And he's a writer. He has his own body of work. He does his own writing, and so he has broken down storytelling and narration and character development for himself. And so when he goes to a movie or watches a TV show and it's disappointing, then he's actually pretty good at figuring out what went wrong. What were the things that they did that offended some core principles of storytelling? And most of the people that we follow, or I follow, and you watch over my shoulder usually, is because I tend to spend, I waste more time on YouTube than you do. And most of them are people who have studied storytelling and narrative and character development and that sort of thing. And you and I were talking a little bit about, offline, we were talking a little bit about what makes a good critic. Like, why are we following some of these people, whereas other people have different things to say and we're not following them? And the first thing I said is, well, they don't have a body of work. In order to be a really good critic, in my opinion, you have to have put the work into understanding what is the core fundamentals of the thing you're criticizing. If you are a person who is just simply responding to how that thing made you feel, and you have no argument for why it worked or it didn't work, then effectively you don't actually know if that thing was good or bad. You could have just come in with a bad mood. Like, it could be 100% you. But if a person has the body of work underneath them or has the study put in to understand why that thing may or may not be good, then they usually have much higher quality criticism, and they can teach their audience something. I'm assuming that, Gordon Ramsay coming in and criticizing some of the restaurants he's helped to save effectively, he has a much stronger perspective on why the restaurant is or is not working out than somebody who just came in and ordered a tuna melt and just didn't like, that they put celery in it or whatever. Like, there's something to be said for a good, solid critic being somebody who knows what they're talking about.
I think in the example of Gordon Ramsay, I'm glad you brought that up. This is a great distinction to make early on in this conversation. Gordon Ramsay's coming in to not be a critic. I mean, he's being critical, maybe, of like the food or the way they're presenting it or whatever in that restaurant. But what he's doing, what his attempt is to calibrate the owner, the chef, the restaurant to doing better and having a better product and service to the customer. Whereas someone that just comes in and has a bad experience and then goes and makes a Yelp review later, just criticizing the experience, isn't helping. I mean, they are helping calibrate in some ways. If the restaurant owner or the chef reads the criticism and there's validity to it, they say something about, well, the soup was too cold. Okay, now they can calibrate and make sure the soup is hot when they bring it out next time. Or the service was slow, they can speed the service up or make it, entertain the guests until the service can get to them or something. So there is calibration elements, but it's not as dialed in as maybe Gordon Ramsay's doing. He's helping to calibrate the owner, the chef, the restaurant. So I think that's a key distinction is calibration versus criticism, first of all. Yeah,
I think that's a great distinction because calibration is about wanting it to succeed. Criticism has no necessary, it doesn't necessarily come with it goodwill, but calibration, I believe, does.
So there's like an intent behind it, basically, behind calibration, wanting things to improve, wanting them to be better, or at least contributing to that end, right? So I think that's a key thing, and I think I see a lot of film critics or story critics or even Yelp review critics, people that are critical, they don't seem to have that intent to make something better. They just want to point out the flaws in something. And I find myself doing that too sometimes. I get caught up in it. I think we all do. I think it's easy to tear down, easy to point the finger at something. And I almost see this crisis coming of criticism. If we don't get a handle on it as humans, without some of that calibration intent to calibrate, it almost seems like we're going to get addicted, and maybe we already are, to just being critical for critical sake. We don't know what else to do. We think that it's like our job or something to just be critical of everything around. I can't tell you how many times I've posted something that I thought was positive online. I'm like, hey, XYZ thing. And it's like, yeah, but you've got to remember. And it's like criticism, like trying to tear down what I'm saying that I thought was a positive message. It's almost like there's no room for something just to be okay anymore. We have to find all the exceptions, all the criticisms, all the ways in which it's wrong or bad, instead of finding the ways which we can apply it and see it's right and good.
Yeah, there's an art to being able to hear something that you don't 100% agree with and be able to mine the gold and the nuggets of what is valuable out of it. And I think that that's a very important skill because nothing is 100% exactly how we see it.
Sure.
Unless you are in lockstep with an agenda. Like if you have turned something or agendized something into an almost religious doctrine, and you're looking for all the markers that tell you that this person is, they're following a canon or they're doctrinally sound. And then at the end of that, because you agree with them 100% on everything, most of the time people aren't criticizing that, not because it's not because it's good, but because they agree with them. And a lot of criticism isn't really about calibrating the quality of something. It's about having a feeler out to make sure that that person is agreeing with your worldview. And I think that's probably one of the reasons, this is a totally personal opinion, But one of the reasons why I think stories and narratives and character development is getting lost, one of them is just because, mainstream media is a dying industry and they're hungry hippo for everything they can possibly get. And so they're, what do we have? Like nothing but reboots and retells and all that stuff trying to cash in on nostalgia. But that said, even if something could be good, one of the challenges is that everyone's looking to make sure that that thing is representing their ideology. And so if it represents their ideology, then they're very forgiving of the quality of the storytelling because they're looking for certain markers that say, well, that represents my ideology, so that must be a good thing. And I'm saying that this happens across the board.
I can't tell you how many times when I was a kid, Christian movies would come out, like Christian-produced movies that sucked really bad as far as movies were made. Like, they just weren't good movies. They didn't have good stories. The characters were flat, but they had the right message. And so the churches and the religious circles I ran in were like, this is an amazing movie, amazing film. Look at how awesome this is. And I kept, like, at the time I was conflicted because it was about a belief I had that I was beholden to. So I was like, yeah, I guess it's got the right message, but I knew something in the back of my head was off because the storytelling was bad. The characters were bad. It just was missing the mark. And some did well. Some movies did well, but often it was ideologically driven. And then I was supposed to, quote unquote, like it or think it was a good movie because it had the right ideology. And I'm kind of seeing the same thing happen again now, like in the world. Like we're supposed to buy things because they have the right ideology, not because they're good stories.
Yeah, and then it allows people to get super lazy. Like they don't have to have good storytelling. They don't have to have good character development. They just have to have the right characters in the right story, right, quote unquote, according to whatever is the ideology it's representing. And then I actually think that that's insulting even to the people who have the quote unquote right agenda or like share their agenda. It's insulting to think that people will just lap things up because it shares their worldview as opposed to itself being quality. And there's something to be said. I mean, you and I, man, we're super careful on our podcast. We don't really talk about what our personal opinions are on almost anything. We talk about our personal development concepts or like the ideas that have helped us out. And we talk about models, but we don't really get into anything that is, in our worldview. And there's a reason for that. We don't want to alienate anybody who might not agree with our worldview and not be able to benefit from what we believe are models that are effective no matter what your worldview is, right? Because all of these models are worldview agnostic. They don't care what your worldview is. They're just beneficial in and of themselves. So we've removed personal opinion and agenda. I mean, I talked about how there's been times in the past I've gotten a little salty about the things I see going on in the world. And then I just tell myself, I'm like, what? Who cares what your personal opinion on reality is? Like, Antonia, shut up. Like, nobody cares what your personal opinion is. And you've got a storehouse of cool stuff, tools and skills that you've developed over time that is beneficial, and people care about that. And then they can just take it and put it into their own, whatever their paradigm or worldview or story is or whatever. Which is why we have people who listen to us that are diametrically opposed in their worldview from us. And I like that. Actually, I really like that. That said, there's something to be said for being careful, but also there's something to be said for if your message has if it's quality enough, if it's good enough and it honors fundamental principles of how people's sort of like their soma responds to something, like how satisfying watching a movie or a TV show is or whatever. If you're obeying those core fundamentals, people will actually forgive things that are not ideologically driven as much. Like I grew up in a religion that didn't celebrate Christmas. And I remember that, I mean, in a way where it's like nobody mentions Christmas, nobody listens to Christmas music, nobody watches Christmas music or movies, like stay as far away from Christmas as humanly possible. And that said, I remember the movie A Christmas Story being one of everybody's favorite movies, almost as if that got special dispensation. Like that movie was so good and so well done at its storytelling that we didn't even have to talk about how it got special dispensation. We just all went, yeah, that's a wonderful movie. And then, of course, the rationalizations of, well, it's not really about Christmas would come up. It's more about like a kid's experience back in the 50s. whatever the rationalization was, it was so good and so high quality that people were willing to ignore or overlook the fact that it wasn't perfectly ideologically a match. And I think really high quality stuff does that. The challenge is that we're in a time period of criticism so much. And I agree with you. I think this is a problem because we see this rating system coming for humans in like a very Black Mirror episode sort of way. It's already happening in other parts of the world where individual people are being rated through social media means, which is, by the way, outrageously insane. Like, I don't know if I can articulate the level of insanity that is and how incredibly dangerous going down that road is.
China's doing it right now.
And yet it's coming for us, right? Like, I don't even know if we can avoid it. And it's such a mind-blowingly bad idea. Let me say again, mind-blowingly dangerous, outrageous idea that we should never, ever implement. And it's coming for us.
Well, it's going to start probably on dating sites. I think that's where it's starting now in a lot of ways. I think it's generally, we're in a world where we don't know people in our community anymore. It's a global village. And so the speed of trust has been disintegrated. We have no ability to build trust personally or have people vouch for each other. And so I think what we're attempting to do is create some kind of a system to accommodate this. I mean, you would never get in a stranger's car unless Uber rated that driver to know that they're safe and effective. And Uber's continually working on safety measures for that as well, because you don't know this person. So it's hard to think in how we're going to get around a global village without some of these rating systems, quite frankly.
Well, it's just built on the backs of us being complete and total lazy. Like, we're just lazy at this point. We're so lazy. We can't have a conversation with somebody. Like, we can't have a conversation that gives us even a mere hint of any sort of like social discomfort, right? Like, we can't talk to strangers anymore. Everything is a digital interface. Like, we have to have everything vetted for us as we enter the world. It's not good, Bob. It's like, it's not healthy. And yet we've just handed ourselves over to it. Like, yeah, that's totally normal to like not spark up a conversation with a stranger that's sitting right there because we haven't engaged with them digitally first. I mean, it's ridiculous. And yet that's where we're headed. So again, terrible, awful, ridiculously outrageous trajectories. And we're on them and we're on these rails and here we go. And so this idea of being critical and being critical of how we're critical, right? Being willing to see that we might be really bad critics. And most of us are, by the way, most of us are terrible critics. But acknowledging that we're terrible critics might be the only thing that saves us in this dystopian future or dystopian future of rating each other and recognizing that we're shit at rating things. We're terrible at it. And we're going to start rating each other. And we're going to start feeling the effects of being rated by other people who are terrible at rating.
So I'm getting really focused these days on tracking my motivations. As an ENFP, my co-pilot of authenticity or introverted feeling, I drink my own Kool-Aid and say, that's my co-pilot. That's what I want to grow in my life. And so one of the exercises that I've focused on is tracking why I do everything. Like, why did I sit at that seat at the table? Why did I eat that food? Why did I get up at this time? Why did I tell that person that thing? Like, I'm tracking all these things, right? I'm trying, or at least I'm attempting to, as much as possible. And one of the things that I've been tracking is when and why I'm critical. And I've noticed that, and I wonder if this works for you too listening. I'd like to hear from you to see if this is the case. I've noticed that when I'm the most critical, like at the height of my criticism, I just have to post this online and be the most critical. Not just like, yeah, I watched the Star Wars movie, it wasn't that great, blah, blah, blah. But like really get like the emotion behind it. I'm critical. I've noticed that it's correlated with a feeling of powerlessness. When I feel powerless, I tend to be more critical than when I feel empowered. And often it's just simple behavior things that I could have done. So for example, if I'm in a restaurant and maybe the food comes out not exactly how I ordered it, this is a first world problem, obviously, but let's just say this is an example. This doesn't really happen very often, but like the food might come out, I don't like it. I have the opportunity to say something there and feel empowered to solve the problem in the moment, or I can be a coward, not feel empowered, And then later on in my car or when I get home, I could pull up a Yelp review and I could say, this food didn't come out very good at this restaurant, and I'd be very critical about something that I could have handled in the moment. And I think the reason why I draw that to attention is I think that's probably what's happening for many of us. You listening, this might be something that's happening for you. In the moments where you don't feel empowered, you then have your criticism later. You have your say in some other format to be critical rather than feeling empowered or putting your head down and doing the things you can do. So I have a feeling, and I don't know for you, Antonia, if this works the same way as far as when you find yourself the most critical. But as I check in with my own motivations, that is one flag that kicks up for me that goes, okay, I'm going to pay attention to that now. When I'm critical, I'm going to reverse engineer and find, okay, where does this criticism point to a feeling of disempowerment? And next time, what could I do to feel more empowered in that moment?
Yeah, that concept of being empowered in post. Like I wasn't empowered in the moment, but hey, you weren't allowed to do that to me, and so now I'm going to be really upset about it and talk about it, as opposed to thinking, okay, what could I have done in that moment, like you're saying, to be an empowered person and to assert the things that I need to assert in order to show self-honor. Like how do I honor myself? And I think in those moments, like the food didn't come out exactly the way I wanted it to come out. There is authentically, for an empowered person, there's authentically a moment where they can go, you know what, it's actually not that bad. It's not that big of a deal. I'm just going to eat it. And there's no sense afterwards of having to complain about it in some sort of Yelp review. And then there's moments when it's not acceptable and you're like, hey, so, like I asked for no cheese on this. Would you be willing to send it back and give me give me the same thing without cheese? 100% of the time they say okay, right? And if you're in a really, really bad situation, we're talking about restaurants where literally everything is messed up, you are empowered to get up and go. Like you don't have to stay there, right? You don't have to have a terrible experience. You can just take off. And in those moments, like you were talking about at the beginning, Joel, there's this difference between being critical and being a calibrator, or being a critic and a calibrator. Some criticism is intended for calibration, and some criticism is intended to just, spew some piss and vinegar. If you're a critic that is attempting to be calibrative, then sometimes those comments that can show up on places like Yelp et al. Can be intended for the manager to see and to go, this is not a great experience. Here are some of the ways that it's not a great experience. And I hope that it's a better experience for people in the future, as opposed to look at what everybody did to me. Like look at my experience and how bad my experience was. And then it's just a matter of, like you mentioned, of having been disempowered in the moment and trying to regain some of that power in post or in the aftermath, not realizing that you can't be empowered in post. You can only learn about how you were disempowered in that moment, and then when you have a similar situation replicated, then take that learning into the second situation and then show up empowered in that moment. So there's no empowered in post, all right? There's only, I could have done better. How can I do better the next time? And I think this idea of intent, like you were talking about, particularly if we head down a road where literally everything, including human beings, are being rated, I think being really honest with what your intent is when you are criticizing things is crucial. This is where actually I think introverted feeling is really important for society, is that it requires us to question what our motivations are when we're doing things.
Yeah, empowerment happens right here, right now, with the thing that's happening. Like you can't, like that's all we can experience is the present moment. I can't retroactively empower myself for 5 years ago. It doesn't exist. It's only in my mind. It's a mental construct. I can only be empowered right here, right now, while I'm talking to you and the person that's listening right now. Like that's it. That's the only moment I have to be empowered. Now I can learn and make markers in my head for empowerment going forward and say like you said, the next time this thing happens, I can behave differently. But there's no way to change the past. It's already happened. So feeling empowered is a present moment thing. And I think that criticism is us attempting to get that after we felt like it didn't go well, right? We want to try to recapture that feeling. And I think feelings are really, really key here. In fact, I would say criticism more than not is tied not just to feeling disempowered, but it's tied to how we feel about things.
Yeah, like a sense of disappointment.
Yeah.
Or our expectations weren't met. A lot of criticism is just how we are emotionally processing things.
Yeah, I think so. And I think this is us trying to make peace with how something made us feel as a person. So I watch, the Rise of Skywalker or whatever the heck the movie's name is. I don't even care that much because it's so horrible.
Somebody out there really liked that movie.
I'm
and
sure.
Like being super triggered.
I'm sure. Whatever.
You're allowed to like the movie, by the way.
You're totally allowed to like the movie. Just whatever. Enjoy it. Enjoy it for everything it's worth.
Enjoy it for the rest of us.
But I'm dealing with the emotions. Like I felt let down. Like I've been part of this franchise and this movie making experience, or this movie, the story, my whole life, and I feel like the filmmakers kind of just went blah, just like let it all fizzle out at the end. It's like, wait, what? Like that, none of it makes any sense, and I'm emotionally trying to come to grips with that. Now, part of my work is just to let it go. It's a movie. It's just a bunch of movies, right? It doesn't really matter at all, and so I'm not that worked up about it. I'm probably amping it up for the show a little bit more. And I think that's to deal with some of those emotions after a football game. When my Pittsburgh Steelers lose, I get critical sometimes about how they played or the coaching or the reffing. And I realize, that's my emotions. I'm trying to reconcile the disappointment I feel, the feeling of I feel disempowered. I couldn't be on the field to do anything. I'm sitting at home watching on TV or in the stands, and I can't actually help the team with anything but just my goodwill toward them, and they lost and I feel disappointed. So I have to be critical sometimes to make myself feel better in a lot of ways. So I think criticism comes up from disempowerment. It also comes up in a feeling of emotion. We're trying to retune our emotions to how we feel about something. And then I also think that we are attempting to calibrate sometimes, but we know that if we try to calibrate in a positive way, people often don't take us serious. And being critical and attempting to hurt or harm, like if I tell again, using an example of a restaurant situation, if I tell the manager, hey, this wasn't the greatest, they might correct it a little bit, but they may never really correct it. But if I go on to a Yelp review and make a review, the assumption is, it's going to hurt their business if they don't correct this. They're going to get on the stick about this. So they'll take it more serious because I'm almost doing them harm. Now, I don't think I've ever left a Yelp review in my life. But if I did, that would be, I think, my motivation to do it is I want them to take it serious enough. And that's what the intent of calibration is, not just to hurt them. It's to, if they don't address it, hurt them enough to make a behavior change, right? So I think that's something else from a motivational standpoint of why we bring criticism to things, is we feel like if we offer calibration, hey, can I help you think about that better? We don't think people will take that serious. But if we say, you did this wrong, and this, people are like, oh, whoa, I gotta be in good graces with people that are criticizing me, and I gotta take this serious. And maybe that's because we take criticism more serious in ourselves rather than calibration help.
Yeah, but then you're also dealing with the extraordinary hubris of believing that whatever your personal opinion is something somebody else should be jumping to react to fix. And so that's also that's making some pretty big assumptions. Like, you had a bad experience at a restaurant. Yeah, well, maybe that was just you. Like, maybe you're the person who brought the bad experience in. It wasn't the restaurant. And the idea that if I leave this terrible critical review, they'll do something about it, I think it just goes back to disempowerment. But on the vein of the hubris, I think the other challenge that we have to look at, and not that I'm critical of stuff all the time, so it probably sounds like I'm saying anytime you're critical, that's a bad thing, which of course would be me criticizing being critical in a very meta way, and I recognize that. But I'm not. Like, there are legit reasons to be critical. Heck, I use introverted thinking. All right, I'm an accuracy person. My brain runs on criticism and caffeine. All right, that's what it does. And so I completely recognize the need for it and how it actually helps the world by having high quality criticism. But I also know that most people's criticism sucks. Most people are terrible, and I don't think that all of us should be critics. Like, most of us shouldn't be critics. Most of us have a very difficult time of filleting out the difference between what's going on for me and the thing that I just experienced that I'm now breaking down and trying to determine was a good or bad experience.
That's nice to say, but literally everything we do, we're presented with a survey, a star rating, a comment field. Like, it might be nice to say we shouldn't all be critics, but we all are expected to societally.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Like, it's some sort of like public service. To give our personal opinion. Heck, we throw out surveys all the time to our audience. So I think you've got a point there. And most of us suck at it. Most of us really do. And I think as a person who uses introverted thinking or accuracy that gets a lot of survey results back and reads a lot of comments and reads a lot of reviews, I've gotten pretty good at almost instantaneously knowing whether or not a person's feedback is of value. I'll go through 50 to 100 reviews on something and pick out maybe half a dozen that I think are solid reviews that are helpful for making a decision, because the overwhelming majority of people are not good at being critics. They just aren't. One of the reasons why is because we take the most offense to things outside of ourselves that reflect back the stuff we don't like about who we are. And so a ton of criticism is actually just projection. It's the stuff that we wish that we could calibrate within us. It's the stuff that we don't like to have reflected back, which is it's a characteristic that lives in us. And we see it outside of ourselves, and we demonize it outside of ourselves, hoping that if we correct it from without, somehow that will correct it from within. This includes things like bad service. Most of us would be terrible. We would be terrible in the service industry. If we're criticizing people doing things that we don't like them to do, particularly, let's just take this social agendized world we live in where everybody's pointing fingers at everybody else. The overwhelming majority of the time that I see people criticizing the people on the other side, in quotation marks, it's almost always things that they are right at that moment offending themselves. They are doing the thing they're criticizing the quote unquote other side for doing in that moment. And they're totally unaware that that's what's happening.
Are you talking about us right now?
Yeah.
Being critical.
Yeah, that's the thing about all these topics is they go real weirdly self-referential and meta real quick. And yeah, most likely I'm probably doing the thing that I'm accusing others of doing. And also that's the challenge, isn't it?
So yeah, and in a world where we don't see this slowing down, you're going to have more star ratings and thumbs up and thumbs down offered to you for everything you do. Right now it's mostly digital. But I've seen even in the physical world, these little, I think there's a button at a doctor's office where you push good service or bad service. I saw recently, everything's being rated constantly. There's a culture or expectation of criticism now. And I think it's genuinely, I think the businesses and the organizations doing it want feedback to calibrate. They're hoping to get calibration. That's why we send surveys out. We want to know what you think, right? I ask at the end of every podcast, I invite you to come and ask questions, give your feedback, share your story about the show, because we understand more about what you need to hear and what is resonating with you listening if you come and do that. So we want to hear feedback. I think feedback is not what we're talking about, or, calibration or even I guess the rating system is good to know kind of how did this land with somebody, star ratings or thumbs up, thumbs down. And yet it's also creating this culture, this opening for us to be critical of everything. So this isn't going to go away. So the question I have, kind of the meta rhetorical question I have, is how do we move through the world as people who want to grow, who want to understand each other, who want to make space for other people that may think or see the world differently than us, not get rid of all criticism. I think there can be valid things from calibration and feedback, but also how do we get away from, I guess, two things. How do we not let it affect us when it's directed at us? Because all of us are going to deal with it coming our direction more and more. And then how do we be better critics ourselves? How do we shift into being better at being critical? So let's tackle the first one. If you are getting criticism, let's say you're a creator or you're somebody that puts something out in the world and you're getting criticism, that's kind of what's going to happen. Anytime you do something in the world these days, there are mechanisms for you to get feedback back to yourself. You have a YouTube channel, you're going to get feedback back. You have a podcast, people are going to rate it and comment about it. If no one's rating or commenting about anything, probably people aren't hearing it. So you're going to get some negative criticisms back to you if you're creating in the world. That's just par for the course. And what do you do about that? One of the things we've learned is a lot of times you don't want to address that criticism directly, because all it does is it attunes you. Part of it, you might not want to look at it, but if you attune yourself to it and you focus too much on the things people are saying that are negative, unless it's everybody saying something negative, you're going to get caught away from the thing you're trying to do in the world. So I think one of the things we've tried to do is we take that energy and we try to turn it into creating more good stuff for the world. Calibrate to it. If there's something valid that somebody says, you can calibrate. You can put something else out in the world that's beneficial and I like to use it to fuel myself to create more body of work, because I think that the body of work speaks for itself. It's easy to sit there and have a comment back to somebody that's critical and, well, you don't understand, and try to defend. But I think the best response is create more work, create more good stuff, create another article, create another podcast, create another video, create another product or service or whatever it is, or refine it and make another better one. Keep pushing forward with doing stuff. Demonstrate, don't articulate. I think that's really the key here, is when you have criticism coming towards you, it's articulation to you to say, this is wrong, picking it apart with the articulated thought of what somebody's saying. And if you articulate back, all you're doing is getting in this back and forth, tit for tat thing. I think demonstrate your ability to produce great stuff, whatever that is, by doing something rather than saying something. That's like the biggest thing that I've learned in the past 5-10 years doing Personality Hacker and other stuff.
That took me a long time to figure out, was this idea that not every single piece of feedback carried with it the weight of the world. And I think that's one of the reasons why I've gotten better at knowing which pieces of feedback, which pieces of criticism are the high value ones versus the noise. And a lot of it is, you can just kind of read in what people are saying, whether or not they're projecting their stuff onto you. A criticism we get all the time is this idea that like we're trying to sell stuff, right? Because we have a podcast we've been doing for almost 6 years, and we don't really we don't put advertising on the podcast. That's a choice we made a long time ago. But we'll advertise our stuff, right? Because that's how we bankroll our business. That's how we survive and are able to do all of this. And the second money comes up, you're going to get a handful of people who are, they're just doing it for money. And it's like, no, there's a lot other easier ways of making money, I guarantee you, than doing what we do, especially sometimes when the things that we do are just completely out of our wheelhouse and it's not very fun and pleasant, and we have to figure out a bunch of stuff and make it up as we go. And there's always a job over there where you're working for somebody else and they've done all the thinking for you. And so there's easier ways to make money. That said, nothing runs on empty. You have to be, money is the blood and the lifeblood of every business. So you have to have that. But then there's always going to be that group of people who are all incensed that money is a part of this interaction. And 100% of the times...
There are always people that don't have any money, by the way.
Well, I was just about to say that in the early days that bothered me, but now it's like, I know they're talking about their stuff. This has nothing to do with me. It has nothing to do with us. It doesn't even have to do with like a business model. It has to do with the fact that they have not made peace with their relationship with resource in some way. They're scarcity minded. They believe everybody's after them. They think that, people just want money and they're greedy. And almost every time now I look at those comments and I'm like, that's you. This is you. You're talking about yourself. You're not talking about me, because in no way have I indicated that is how I roll. And so if you're projecting this onto me, that means it's coming from within you, and that makes you greedy. Even if you have scarcity, it's greed on your side. And that's something that you're going to have to contend with, and that's not my problem. And I get to just glaze my eyes over when I see your comments. And then we'll get comments where the person will say really valuable stuff, where they'll say things like, I was disappointed in the quality of this because I thought it was going to be like this, but it actually ended up being closer to this. And I just wish this had been higher quality. Immediately, my ears perk up and I go, okay, so quality is important to me. So where did we fail in the quality of this thing? And I recognize that that's not about them. They're articulating the disappointed emotion, but they're not doing it to be quote unquote empowered in post. They are doing it to articulate to us something that we could do better for future people. And I'm grateful for that kind of feedback. So criticism, I think, doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing. Again, it's whether or not it falls on the calibrative side versus on the personal, they're just trying to work through their shit and they haven't succeeded side.
I don't think it just comes from, I guess it comes from not succeeding on certain things or having that perspective. I also think that there is a sense of, it's very easy to not realize what it takes to do something. Like, as an example, every year, twice a year, we open up enrollment for our profiler training course. And it's a really exciting time. We open up for new students to come into the course, and we release videos online of you or one of our coaches doing profiling sessions. And I actually turn the comments off on YouTube when I release those, because I know people are eager to have ego expressions of how they might be right and you might be wrong. For example, Antonia, in a profiling session you do, and it's not coming from necessarily always a place of like ill intent. It sometimes is coming from a place of pure ignorance in that they have no idea what it takes, and I've been guilty of this too, no idea what it takes to do what you're doing. It's easy to sit online and watch a video and go, well, you could do this and this and this, and retroactively, where you can pause it and think about it. And when you're live on stage doing this in front of an audience, it's a whole different ballgame. You've got lights on you, cameras on you, 100 people in an audience. You've got your subject who's got a time constraint, has to go somewhere. There's a lot of moving parts here, and you're trying to do it to model it for others. And there's a whole bunch of stuff happening that the person at home watching doesn't realize what's going on. And so they're not necessarily ill-intended. They just don't have enough territory to know what happens in one of those profiling sessions. And they're falling back on something they've done in the past, which is typing, right? It's something we all do for fun. We type online, celebrity typing, but it's not professionally, seriously sitting down and profiling somebody through a process that we're trying to learn and continue to refine. And so I think it's not always bad intent. Sometimes it's just it's unconscious incompetence, not knowing what it takes to do something. I can remember I had a job once when the CEO of the company was up for leaving, and they were like looking for somebody else, the president of this organization, nonprofit. I was like, I could do that job. And I was kind of kidding to the coworkers I was around. And I also wasn't. I literally thought I could do the job and manage the moving parts. And I almost, in a kind of almost a joking fashion, was going to go to the executives and say something like, I could do this. Thank God I didn't. I was so stupid and incompetent around it. I had hubris and hubris alone. There was no way I could do this job. I had some talent, and maybe through experience I could do it. But come on. There was no way I'd be equipped to be the president of a fairly large, $20 million a year nonprofit. I just didn't have the skill set or experience enough in my early 30s. And I think this is something that happens a lot. We all think things that are easier than they actually are. So I think also when you're getting criticism back, sometimes you just eliminate the ability to get criticism like we do with those videos, just because it doesn't serve the purpose of what we're trying to do, which is to find, I say we don't want a lot of people in profiler training. We want the right people. We don't want a ton of people. We want the right people there, and having those comments or criticisms coming back, it's not we can't take them. It just distracts from what we're trying to do, which is get the right students in the class. So I think that's something we can do too, is if you are a creator, you can go ahead and just not accept criticism for certain things you put out there. Just let it stand and speak for itself. You don't always have to have feedback for everything you do.
Yeah, I admittedly put far less weight on people's feedback when they don't have a body of work. When a person has a body of work, when they've built something and they know what it feels like and they know the experience of having built something and gone through all the blood, sweat, and tears, they have more perspective on what it takes to go into something like what we're doing. And if a person doesn't have a body of work and they haven't gone through those experiences, it's a lot easier for me to it's very easy to not listen to their feedback, because they don't know what they're talking about in quite a few elements. And oftentimes those are relevant to the system running, even if they do know what they're talking about in one way. And that doesn't mean that person doesn't have anything to offer. It's just, it's harder to vet what they have to say as having something to offer if they don't have, if they haven't demonstrated that they understand a bigger picture. And I do think that when it comes to the criticism that we throw around, one of my favorite critics online that criticizes stories and movies and TV shows, one of the reasons why I like him is because he's a writer. He writes his own novels. And because he writes his own novels, regardless of whether or not he's a really famous writer or not, he has enough of a body of work so that he knows what it takes to create a compelling story. He knows what it takes to have to be consistent in the storyline and to have those core principles underneath stories and to have compelling characters and that sort of thing. He knows that it's tough. And so when he's criticizing other people, he's not just doing it in I'm disappointed, it should have been a better story. He's saying, I understand how complicated and difficult it is to create a compelling story, and here are some of the ways that the storytelling was offended. And I think taking this, into this idea of criticizing each other and criticizing each other's work or criticizing what each other has to say, I mean, I almost can't write a Facebook post anymore without just having criticism. I know, even if I'm just representing my own life or my own opinions or something that's going on, I'm just waiting for the backlash post, right, of the person who is criticizing what I'm saying. And I think that idea of the body of work that I mentioned in regards to the business, I also have to, I bring that same principle into people criticizing my personal opinions in the sense that most of the time, these are very young people and they haven't really gone through much life. Like they're just starting out, and it's very easy to be ideological when you're young. It's very easy to believe that you're at the receiving end of life. The older you get, there's a certain moment when you go, it doesn't really matter how much bitching I'm going to do. I'm going to have to be the person who does this. I'm going to have to be the person who figures this out. I can't complain loud enough to enough people so that they're going to come save me. There's no cavalry. I'm the person who is in control of my life, and now I've got to get to work. And then through all of that and all the blood, sweat, and tears that happens in a body of work that is called a life at the, I'm only 42. I like to say only, but I'm really I'm midpoint, right? I'm not old. I'm not almost at the end of my life. I'm at the midpoint of my life. So I've learned some lessons and I still have some idealism inside of me. And I also have a lot less idealism than people much younger than me who oftentimes come at me because I'm not being idealistic enough for them. And I just have to go, you know what? Your body of work of your life, it's coming. And I'm just going to make some space, and I'm going to take your criticism for what it is, which is somebody who's got a couple decades to figure some stuff out, right? And it's going to be fine. And I think it's not marginalizing these people and saying that they are of no value. It's just knowing that the criticism that they're giving is very weighted onto their ideals and their imagination of how things work and the disappointments that they're dealing with in their life, and how a lot of times their criticism is a cry for help in some ways. It's them processing through their emotions and saying things aren't panning out the way that I thought they were going to pan out. And I'm hoping that somebody will hear me and help me do something about that. And the best thing you can do is just let them figure out that nobody's going to do anything about that for them. They're going to have to navigate through it on their own. And maybe that's the best element of criticism, is just not caring on some level, is just letting that person thrash through their criticism and allowing them to figure things out on the other side on their own without taking it personally.
It is really hard to hear criticism about yourself or something you've done and just let it be. It's like really hard to do. Like I am so challenged with that. Somebody might say something and I'm like, I want to respond. I want to set the record straight. I want to be right, or I want to have them understand especially when, for me as an introverted feeling authenticity person, if that criticism projects any kind of ill intent onto me, like I've got bad intent toward the person that's giving me that criticism, or they feel that way, or bad intent in any space, I'm like, oh my gosh, I can't deal with that. I've got to set the record straight. I'm good intended here. You've got to see. And I used to get panicked and like want to set it right and let them know that I'm good intended. And it's really hard to go ahead and let people believe that I'm ill-intended sometimes, or that, I'm not good at this thing or whatever, when they don't know what all the moving parts are or what's going into it. Letting that just sit as is, that is really tough. And I think that's the work, though, for creators, for people that put something into the world, that body of work you're talking about. That's really important for us to realize. We have to put it out there and just let the critics do what they do. Look for the calibration, but don't get too caught up in it, and don't feel like you have to answer all of it all the time.
I think all of us are creators too, because as I mentioned, your body of work is your life, regardless of whether or not you're in a creative class, profession. And all of us are creators in our lives. And I think for me, one of the best things that ever happened to me is that when I left the religion of my youth, most of the people who, of course, didn't talk to me after I left, all had a very wrong opinion about how that went down. They all believed I left for one certain reason or committed one atrocious act or whatever it was that the story was. And it was actually very different. The reality was very different. And I couldn't go back and talk to those people and clarify. Like, I had to let them believe erroneous things about me because they wouldn't talk to me and allow me to clarify what had happened. And that was the worst feeling in the world for a couple of years. This idea that everybody believed the wrong thing about me and had all these stories about me that were inaccurate. Oh my goodness. And then at one point, I realized it didn't matter. Like, it didn't matter. It was okay that they all thought the wrong thing. And if they wanted clarification, well, I was still alive, I existed, and they could always give me a call. And if they chose not to do that, if they chose to keep their erroneous opinion, that just was what it was. And there was nothing I could do about it. And that was okay. And I think because I had such a gut-wrenching experience of that in my early 30s, a decade later now, I'm totally fine if people have the wrong spin on what's going on for me. Now, I have to be a little bit more conscientious about it because I have a business, and the business is going to be affected and impacted if people have too much of the wrong take. So there's a little image management that's got to go in there to some extent. But as long as it doesn't impact our business, I don't give two craps if somebody has the wrong take on me or thinks the wrong thing or accuses me of the wrong thing. And I believe that is the emergent of having had maybe the worst experience of that. So everything else is up from here, right? And I feel like being able to make peace with people thinking ill of you, being able to make peace with people having erroneous criticism. Because again, most of the time, it's just their stuff. Like, they're projecting onto you their shit that they haven't worked through. And so you might as well be a cardboard cutout. You're basically a mirror at that point. And just recognizing that you can be a mirror and you don't have to absorb it. Like, you don't have to be a sponge, right? Like, you don't have to take it in and feel like there's something wrong with you if other people are thinking bad things about you or criticizing you. You can totally live with it. And it's surprisingly survivable. It's shockingly survivable to deal with other people's criticism that's wrong.
So we've been talking about the creator side of that, which we kind of believe everybody's a creator, at least a creator of your life. You're writing your life story. You're creating your life as you go through it one day at a time. And that's on that side. But what about the critical side? If you want to be a critic, if you want to bring calibration to the world or be critical of things, are there ways we can think about doing this better? And to kind of kick this part of the conversation off, I want to say that I think satire is some of the best criticism I've ever seen in my life.
I totally agree.
I love satire. I think it's fun. I think it's accessible for people, and I think it's reflective for us as humans. And comedy can also be really great criticism as well. I think comedy and satire, I think of the show South Park on Comedy Central is a very satirical show, and they pick on everybody. They're very critical, basically, of society in general and business and organizations and religion and social causes. Like, they're just critical of everything, but they do it satirically, which I think is very clever. Whether you agree with their criticism or not and their satire, it's still compelling. It's done well because it's not just It's like painting a picture. It's helping us see a representation of something in the world, and it's reflective back to ourselves. I think comedy does the same thing. Stand-up comedians are very reflective. I think there's an attack on comedy right now because it's so effectual. It's like that court gesture of our modern times, and our egos are so sensitive we can't even hear the jokes anymore. We can't even laugh about them. We're too seriously minded about stuff, and I see comedians under attack because of it. But it's a very effective tool of critically pointing back to us in our culture. It's a calibration tool, both satire and comedy, I think, of showing us where we could maybe do better as people, as society, as organizations, as cultures. And these are very powerful tools for us. Again, that's kind of bridging the gap between the creator world and the critic world. These are critics. The guy, Trey and Matt at South Park are probably very critical people. And they said, instead of just getting on, YouTube, well, YouTube didn't exist when they started back in the 90s, but instead of just being critics, film critics, we're going to create satire that points out the things that frustrate us about the world or we think are absurd or silly. We want to reflect back to society something through a funny, clever cartoon show on Comedy Central. I think it's a really powerful framework.
Satire requires a lot of thought. It's very intelligent, actually.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, if it's well done, anything can be poorly done and have no thought into it. But if it's well done satire, then it means there's been a lot of thought into the thing that they're being satirical about. So they can't just take a surface position on it. And I think that's the challenge with a lot of criticism these days, is that critics are usually representing some sort of agenda. And so they are by definition seeing the other thing two-dimensionally, because their agenda means that they have to promote an ideology or a worldview. That means that anything that is against that ideology or worldview is the enemy. So they have to, it's in their best interest to paint the other side as two-dimensional. But when you do something like satire, you can't do that. You have to you have to pop the hood open, and you have to look at the mechanisms that are happening underneath the thing you're being satirical about. And so I think a big piece of criticism is thoughtfulness. Is being critical a reaction for you? Are you simply reacting to something that triggered something inside of you, and now you're criticizing that thing? Or did you take time and effort to really get inside, look under the hood, really get into the mechanics of what's happening underneath it all? And part of that thoughtfulness requires that we do the same thing for us, because again, a lot of criticism is projection. So it requires us to be we have to have a sense of introspection about all of it. We have to be thoughtful about what it is inside of ourselves that is reacting to the thing we don't like.
In that vein, something intuitive is coming up for me in this conversation. I haven't thought this thought out yet, so I'm playing with this live right now. This idea of cancel culture, or stopping things from happening, like disinviting people on college campuses from speaking and things like that. Could we look at that as a way to not be critical? Because if that person came to speak, or that show or that thing was on the air longer, or that person was able to have a YouTube channel, we don't like the fact we're so critical, so we're trying to cancel things to combat the overcritical nature that we've become, this addiction we have for criticism? Or could we look at it more with the inability for people to see things with more dimensions, and they don't want to see things with lots of dimensions. They just want to see it two-dimensional. But if that thing is allowed to exist, and again, I'm not trying to pick on any specific ideology here, I'm just trying to think in terms of like a meta perspective of this. If that exists, we now have to think about it critically and sophisticatedly and try to understand that perspective. So is it more, again, I'm working this thought out. Do you have a sense, Antonia, that it's more like we're kind of disheartened or disgusted by our critical nature, so we want to remove these things so we're not critical? Or do you think we don't have the ability to hang there and talk about the nuance of things, and so we cancel stuff because we can't be sophisticated in the way we talk about it because it makes our brains hurt? We can't like rise to the occasion of that for an actual legitimate debate.
Well, I think it's a sympathetic way of looking at cancel culture if you take the first take. If it's like we're being cancel culture or trying to basically have modern day versions of burning witches, but we don't do it with actual burning people alive. We just destroy them as human beings and any potential they have for putting anything out into the world from that point on. If you're going to see that as an attempt to get away from being critical by simply not looking at it, I think that that's one of the more generous ways of looking at that. And I suspect that it's the latter, not the former.
Because that's what I do in my life. I don't look at the news because it makes me too critical. So I just want to remove it. I kind of cancel news from my viewpoint because I just feel bad when I look at it so much.
Yeah, I agree that there's probably some element of trying to avoid that piece of who we are. And that's the challenge. Like I mentioned, I think it's more the latter than the former. I think it's more that we're just tired of having to be thoughtful about everything. I think people are mentally exhausted by trying to reconcile multiple worldviews and multiple agendas. And when you're really emotionally attached to your own worldview and paradigm, particularly if you're in a context where it's being constantly reinforced and you don't have to think outside of it, then just even a little bit of pushback feels very tiring because you haven't built the psychological muscle to be able to hold both positions. This idea of intelligence being rooted in being able to hold two conflicting ideas at the same time and being able to study them, I think in some ways we've lost that definition of intelligence. We feel like it's actually noble to only hold one position in our head and not be able to critically look at both our position and maybe another person's position that conflicts with it, to be able to hold them both and see them from multiple positions and being able to play around with them. There's almost a sense that that's ignoble because there's lacking purity to the one position that you're supposed to be representing. And the reality of the situation is that, unfortunately, that's the opposite of how it works. Because if you only hold one agenda, one paradigm, one perspective, one worldview in your mind, you are now opening it up for complete and total corruption. Because purity comes from refinement. You can't purify something that is stagnant. It has to be put through a purification process of refinement. And we refine ideas by rubbing them up against each other. That's how it works. And so if you can't hold two positions in your head simultaneously, then you have corrupt ideas. It doesn't matter what that idea is. It honestly doesn't. And so the idea of pushing away anybody that we don't want to hear could, in some levels, like you mentioned, having introverted feeling or authenticity has taught you that almost everything comes with multiple intents. So there's almost always a system of intent running with multiple different representatives. And one of those could be, it could be the representative of just not wanting to think ill about somebody else, so wanting to push it out because we don't want to have to think ill. But unfortunately, in cancel culture, we've already chosen to feel ill about that person. So that's not what we're avoiding. We're actually avoiding their presence that might require us to give attention and more thoughtfulness and maybe some credibility to ideas that contradict our own. Like, we might have to see that there is some truth in the other. There always is. Otherwise, those people wouldn't hold those positions, because the brain cannot, it can't rest on something that is 100% untrue. It rejects it outright. The idea of like the teapot that's circling around the moon. Like nobody holds that position in anything else other than a metaphor for other things that people believe are untrue. And so when something is simply an untruth, it gets immediately rejected from the mind. So anything that sticks has an element of truth to it. And it's our job to fillet what those elements of truth are and why there's a stickiness to it. And when somebody presents an opinion that we believe is diametrically opposed from our own, and we don't want to see that there's a stickiness about that other position, meaning that there's truth in it, and we don't want to have to do the heavy mental lifting of figuring out what is truthful about that other person's position, then we push it away and we try to we try to distance ourselves from the work that they're representing our brains. And that's why we end up with things like cancel culture, in my opinion. But I also think that it's interesting that you bring that up, because I think that there are elements of that that are also part of why we're critical. We're critical because we don't want to see that other thing. We don't want to see why there's stickiness to it oftentimes. And to be a really good critic means that you have to acknowledge the positives as well as the negatives. You have to see what things actually did work so you can also see what didn't work. And that requires holding conflicting pieces of information in your head. There's something about this restaurant which validates its existence. Like, there's something that's working here. There's a restaurant that exists. And if there's something that isn't working about it, then time will bear that out, and that the restaurant will no longer exist over time. But for the moment, it's existing. So there's some inertia here. There's some energy here that indicates that something's working in this restaurant. And I had a bad experience of it. So when I'm being critical and I'm saying things like, nobody should ever go to that restaurant, it's the worst thing in the world, nobody should ever go there, I don't understand why anybody would spend their money there, that's just you being in a tizzy. Right? That's not you actually giving any sort of calibrative criticism to this franchise or establishment. And I think that that holds true with everyone. And again, going back to the terrible, terrible, terrible idea of rating each other in social media, I cannot say that often enough, because in my opinion, it's literally downfall of society to do shit like that. And yet here we are, just about to adopt it probably in the next 20 years. The one thing that I believe that we all have to do is recognize how much of us doesn't want to give merit to the other when we've had a bad experience. So it's also acknowledging that somebody else who we don't like is a valid person who has relationships with other people, and somehow something about them is good and positive in the world. So being willing to take the thought labor step of figuring out what is good and positive in the other, and then just trying to figure out why you didn't have a good experience with them, and flaying out whether it was you, whether it was them, whether it's the system running, whether that there's even anything here to talk about, because a lot of times there isn't even anything to discuss. There's no need for criticism. I think all of those things, I would hope that as we become a more and more critical culture, that we'll juggle all of that stuff, and that we'll get better and better at being self-referential and introspective as we continue to give all of this criticism out.
I think that's a key point. And, I think back to what I started the conversation with around Star Wars. If I'm fully critical of that, critical in the positive and the negative, I look at the dumbed down stories and the overdone graphics and the focus on all the emotive cinematic moments over the storyline and character development. And I realize that a movie studio that's creating a film for a global audience that doesn't all speak the same language has to strip the story down to its, really, really, really basic components of like like momentary emotional experiences, because not everyone's going to speak English, for example, that's watching this film, or understand maybe nuance of jokes or cultural references, because it's a global marketplace. And so that movie needing to be global, I understand they have to do certain things to make it make money. And so it works from that standpoint. It makes a ton of money. These movies are making tons of money, and they're merchandising. They're tied into theme parks, tied into merchandise lines of product. And that's basically a driver. It's an energy driver to drive sales in merchandise and theme park tickets and streaming subscriptions and all this. It's designed to do what it's doing well. And as a movie, it fails. But if you look at it in a broader picture of what it's trying to accomplish, it's doing it very, very well. It's accomplishing that on great scale.
Totally. And I would argue that the reason why Star Wars is such a beloved franchise is because they have so many iconic characters, and they've done such a good job of articulating these characters over a really long timeline. And one of the challenges is that Rey is this ridiculously overpowered character who did not do the training that she's supposed to do and can call on all sorts of powers that heretofore did not exist in this universe, and everything bends for Rey. And unfortunately, that has turned Rey into a very uncompelling character. One of the biggest challenges is that I think that they tried to make her, I don't know, an empowered whatever. Like I have no idea what the ultimate end game for Rey was. But whatever it was, unfortunately fell flat because we're used to expecting really charming characters coming out of Star Wars. And the main protagonist of the last 3 movies did not accomplish that. I'm a huge, huge Adam Driver fan. If you die, Joel, I'm immediately getting in a car and trying to figure out where Adam Driver is, because he's totally my celebrity crush. And he falls so flat as Kylo Ren. It's insane. Somebody who I have a massive, massive celebrity crush on, I can't stand in those movies because it's not good character writing. And the reason why I'm critical of this is because I've come to expect more out of Star Wars. So I have to acknowledge that like the thing that Star Wars did so well and works and is sticky, and there's a reason why there's this franchise that's made billions upon billions of dollars. In this one thing, it really fell flat, and that's the disappointment. It's sadness. A lot of my criticism comes from sadness,
sure, not
from it's not intended to be pejorative. It's not intended to be like a superior or condescending. It's just sadness,
disappointment.
It's disappointment. I think I saw Return of the Jedi in the theater when I was like 5 or 6 years old, and so these stories have stuck with me since I was a little kid, as they have with you. And I think it's just kind of sad. It's like I wish they had done better, but they didn't, in my opinion, and I wish they had.
And if I zoom out, the point of what I'm trying to say is if I zoom out, I can see what at least the Walt Disney Company is trying to do and Lucasfilm is trying to do. And if you look at what they're trying to do there, it's working and they are successful at it.
They're not going to lose any money.
Yeah, I might not like it. And I think a lot of young people, they didn't grow up with those stories. They don't have the tethering. And so this is a fresh story for them.
Yeah.
And with a culture inundated with superhero movies, this fits right in line with that. It almost feels more like superhero movies than it does the old Star Wars movies.
Yes, in the modern zeitgeist, it's falling in line with the modern zeitgeist.
So I'm trying to find the elements that are done well, or at least try to appreciate it for what it is instead of what I want it to be, which I think is powerful for critics. If you want to be a critic, understand what are you looking at that it's trying to be, and what do you want it to be. And sometimes your criticism of wanting something to be something else, you're not really being critical of the thing itself. You're just wishing it was something different, and you're trying to be critical because you want to change it to your sandbox of what you want.
Yeah, maybe Star Wars just isn't for us old fogies anymore.
Maybe not.
It's for another generation.
So let's briefly just kind of, as we wrap up here, talk a little bit about how to be a better critic. I think some of the things we've talked about, let's just get a little list going here. If I want to be a better critic in my life, and you listening want to be a better critic in your life, bring better criticism to the world and think higher of this in a way, or think of doing this in a better way, I should say. I think this idea of calibration over criticism is key. Think in terms of when I'm being critical, am I helping to calibrate something, or am I just trying to tear something down? And I think there is room for forest fires, metaphorically speaking, tearing things down, being critical of things that are just absolutely should not exist. Understanding, though, that when you tear that down, you can leave a vacuum. So I still think it holds that calibration, even when you're being critical to create that metaphoric forest fire. what do you expect to be replaced instead of it? Like if you rip this apart critically, what's going to be in its place? And sometimes it's worse than the thing you criticized in the first place, right?
Ain't that the truth? That absolutely can happen. Is you have this idea of how the world should be, you rail against something, you damn the man, you're the anarchist that's bringing this thing down, and then the thing that replaces it is 10 times worse than its predecessor. So having a thoughtfulness around, is this something that should be destroyed? Is this something that should be brought down? Or is there a way to calibrate it and make it better over time, not just burn it to the ground? I think that's such a good point.
I think the other thing is perspective. Like having perspective of what's actually going on. Leaving a Yelp review for a bad meal at a restaurant is a very different thing than being critical of the school system in your town and how they're handling the busing situation, or how a business is treating its employees. Like there's different levels of this, perspectives of this. And most of the times when we're critical, we're zoomed way into our personal experience, and it really doesn't matter at the end of the day. Like when I'm critical of maybe food service somewhere, I mean, I live in a very blessed country. I have a lot of personal blessings in my life. I benefit from a lot of things and systems that came before me that I didn't earn. And if you live in a Western country, you probably in a very similar situation. And so when we're critical, we have to almost, I use that phrase at the very beginning, that first world problem, # first world problems, right? It's kind of a joke, but it's also something that especially people that are in the West or outside of developing countries, we don't always have perspective on what the world actually looks like outside of our comfort zones. And we're super critical when we're uncomfortable. And I think that that's something just to keep in perspective. This notion of, is this really that big of a deal? Do I really have to be critical of this thing? Is this something that I really do need to voice? And maybe you answer yes. But often I found in my life, like, why am I so upset about this? Why am I being so critical about this thing? Again, usually it points to some kind of emotion or disempowerment I felt personally. It usually isn't even something on a bigger scale. And when I'm critical of big scale things, that still is often true. The perspective still has to be there that the reason why this politician makes me upset is because I feel disempowered. Or the reason why this thing over here makes me feel frustrated or I'm critical of it is because I am trying to emotionally reconcile how I feel about this. I think that's happening a lot, whether it's a big thing or a little thing. So it's not to say that you shouldn't be critical, but just have some perspective, take a breath, and just really focus in and say, what is this that I'm trying to be critical of? Like, why does this matter? What's the lowest common denominator here? At the end of the day, why do I care so much about this thing? Why does it make me so critical in the way I'm showing up?
Yeah, and to piggyback on that, empowerment is an inside job. It's a feeling you have. To be empowered is generative from within. And so a lot of times kicking the can of that responsibility over to others and being critical, hoping that the universe will care that you're being loudly critical and change to suit you is unlikely. It doesn't happen that way most of the time, which I think creates a lot of dissatisfaction in people, and then they just complain louder. But empowerment is inside of you. And it's not really something anybody else can do for you in your behalf. You must create it on your own. And that idea of being empowered in post, right? Like having had a situation where you were not empowered in that moment and you were not representing yourself well, or you were not representing your interests and you were not honoring yourself, complaining about it later very infrequently does anything for you. I mean, even if you move the needle in some way, you're still not going to be an empowered person. That was not empowerment. That was complaining about you being disempowered in that moment. And the only solution is to do the work of the next time you're in a situation where you need to represent your interests, that you speak up for yourself and you show yourself self-respect and self-honor by navigating that with power in that moment. But that empowerment and post thing is a fantasy. It's not something that will ever make you feel better.
Finally, when you sit down to be critical and you're finding yourself ready to criticize, how can I, I'm asking this question rhetorically as well, how can we alchemize our criticism into gratitude? How can we find the things to be grateful for in the moments when they're seemingly ungrateful? Or it's hard to find the gratitude, I should say. like seemingly this is going bad or wrong or it's difficult, and I want to be critical of it, where can I find the gratitude? You know, like again, I'll zoom in on the restaurants since we've been talking about this the whole time. The food comes out not exactly how I wanted. How can I be gratitude or have gratitude there? How can I express gratitude in that moment? Well, I have the resource to be in a restaurant in the first place. I'm grateful that I'm blessed to be there in that state, in that moment, to have food prepared for me and brought to me. Like that was the luxury of kings 2,000 years ago. You know, that didn't just happen to normal people at a price point that's pretty affordable for most people in, you know, Western societies or even in developing countries at this point. So there's gratitude or gratefulness there. What are the things that we can find out when we're trying to be critical or we're wanting to criticize something? What can we reflect back to ourselves and go, you know, what is the gratitude in this? And if you start disciplining and practicing that, you're going to find gratefulness everywhere. There's so much to be grateful for. There's so many things to be grateful for. Maybe the server is really friendly and you can be grateful for that. Again, I keep zooming in on that example because it's tangible. I think it's something we can mostly relate to. Where's the gratitude in the criticism? You want to criticize some politician or some policy or some organization or something that's happening. Well, what can you be grateful for around them? And I'm telling you, that's going to be a challenge for you. Trust me, especially if it's something you really despise or it's difficult for you to find anything but criticism in yourself. But training yourself this way, I think, is a really interesting discipline. It starts to refocus your mind onto stuff, away from the critical nature that's so easy for our culture to drag us into, and focus us on the things that actually matter, the things that we're grateful for. And the way we tune our minds, that starts to now have things happen in our lives that are more positive. If we're critical, we're going to find more things in life to be critical about. If we're grateful and positive, we're going to find more things to be grateful and positive about. That's just how it works. Our brains will find what they're looking for. And so if we train our brains around that, I think we're going to have a much better experience. And I don't think we're going to be caught up and slaves to being critics. All of us will have a freedom of finding non-criticism in things that happen, which can be really, really exciting for our world going forward.
Yeah, I agree. And then there's Game of Thrones, for which you can find nothing to be grateful for in the last season.
Yeah, and well, it's a pretty dark show in general, though. I mean, there's really nothing. It wasn't really a positive energy being put in the world in the first place.
Yeah, maybe that's why it had to crash and burn, is because it wasn't putting good juju in the world.
I mean, what value does it actually bring to the world in a positive way? I mean, I guess it's storytelling.
It was pretty compelling storytelling for a long time, and then that last season, there's just nothing. There's nothing. It's a desert.
It's some pretty dark energy, though, the whole show.
It was, and maybe that's why it had to have its inevitable conclusion of just dissatisfaction.
Yeah.
And I agree with everything you said.
What do you think? You've been listening along. Are you a critic? Are you a creator? Are you both? How has criticism shown up for you in your life? Are you overly critical, or have you found a way to manage this? We want to hear from you. Come over to personalityhacker.com directly below this episode. Leave your feedback. Leave your criticisms if you want. Ask your questions. And more importantly, share your stories. If you can share a story with us and the community, I think that's really powerful. We learn a lot from stories as people, and it really connects it to your personal life, and we get a sense of who you are. So come over to personalityhacker.com and make your voice heard.
Now I'm going to do the thing I do every podcast, but now I feel self-conscious about it because we're talking about how we're creating a culture of criticism by asking people to rate things and review them. So maybe I won't do that this time. Or maybe I should anyway. Because
just do it. It's fine.
All right. It's not that big of a deal, right? I'm not training you, the listener, to be a critical person, am I? By asking you to come over to iTunes and leave a rating and review on iTunes. That helps us out a lot if you like the podcast. You can also subscribe to us in various places. I'm now all out of whack. I'm like what am I supposed to say? Okay, I'm going back to the beginning of my script. If you enjoy this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms.
You got it.
If you enjoyed it, you can leave a rating and review on iTunes. That helps us out a lot.
You got it.
Then I go to the book and I say, we have a book out. It's called Personality Hacker. You should totally go read it. And if you enjoy it, well, actually, I should tell you that you can get it at Amazon and Books A Million and Barnes & Noble and other retailers. And if you enjoy it, you can leave a rating and review on Amazon or on Goodreads. That also helps us out a lot. And I'm not trying to train you to be a critical person. Just come over if you like us. Right? That's okay, right?
Absolutely.
Okay. It's like a calibration thing. It's all well intended.
I think I usually say something like, your life is not complete until you have the Personality Hacker book on your shelf.
I know. That's a pretty strong statement.
It's true, though. I believe it to the core of my being.
Yeah.
And I think that it applies to you listening. So make sure you've got a copy of the book on your shelf and snap a picture. Show us on Snapchat or not Snapchat, Instagram or something like that.
Yeah, we're not Snapchat people. We're just too old for Snapchat.
I've tried. I was like, what in the world?
I couldn't even try. I was like, all right, I'm old. I'm done. I'll go back to Instagram. That's fine.
My name is Joe Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk with you on the next Personality Hacker Podcast.